reason that we're holding a meeting on this topic is that ethnomethodology has been around for quite some time, over half a century, and I thought it would be a good time to discuss what is, was, or still could be radical about ethnomethodology in some meaning of radical, which is something that we need to discuss. And especially in light of the current state of the field, and by the field I'm including conversation analysis and ethnomethodology as part of a more or less coherent field. And also developments in the social sciences over the past half century. This particular meeting isn't designed to stage a debate with people who might be opposed to what we're saying or deny what we would be arguing, but there will certainly be, and there was yesterday, discussion, some differences of opinion, some of them fairly sharp, but we're not staging it as a debating thing. We're staging it as presentations about, from somewhat different perspectives, what is or is not radical about ethnomethodology, or still could be radical. And then questions, of course, can open up all sorts of things. It's also, despite some rumors to that effect, this is not an effort to split ethnomethodology into factions, but more of a reminder of what or where ethnomethodology came from originally, and how important some of those original initiatives are for current and future work in the field. As I said before, ethnomethodology goes back for more than a half century. Next year is the 50th anniversary of the publication of Studies in Ethnomethodology, which was by no means the beginning of ethnomethodology, although it was a landmark publication and still is. Harvey Sachs's transcribed lectures, which gave rise to conversation analysis, not on their own, of course, but go back to '64, and some of his notes and writings go back even earlier. And at this point in history, of course, the founders of ethnomethodology are mostly gone. Some are still alive, but not very active. Others of us are hoping to stay alive for a bit longer and are trying to stay as active as we can as we fade into the sunset. But certainly those best known for the beginnings of ethnomethodology have left us sometimes quite a while ago. So the idea here is to take stock of the current situation in ethnomethodology and for the prospects for ethnomethodology. And some of the questions, there'll be lots of questions that'll come up. I certainly won't control the questions. Questions like, is or was it always unreasonable to imagine ethnomethodology could be indifferent to sociology, and other disciplinary fields could forge a path of its own that is somehow distinctive and not beholden to the traditions of theory and method in social science. Also, what possibilities remain in and beyond academia for producing, sustaining, and developing radical initiatives? And we have people in this room, of course, who have gone beyond academia or outside academia to find niches in the world for ethnomethodology. The inspiration of the meeting comes from Harold Garfinkel, who actually left some funding that is being used for this meeting. The coffee you're drinking was paid for by Harold Garfinkel. He didn't know it, though. He left some money to do an open-ended agenda with, and I've been wondering what to do with it, and this was one thing that seemed to be a worthwhile undertaking. Now, you could never, knowing Harold Garfinkel as I did, you could never guess whether he'd approve an agenda like this or denounce it. So I can't really invoke his blessing. Not that he was better at cursing than blessing, but you know, he had that line about the company of bastards in ethnomethodology. And he was actually quite a nice gent most of the time, but there were other moments. We're going to have in this program today 5 one-hour sessions. I'll start immediately with the first of them, kind of an overview of radical ethnomethodology. We'll then have a coffee break, and Doug Macbeth will present a paper on, does ethnomethodological conversation analysis have a soft underbelly? Dusan Bielich and I will then present, demonstrate a phenomenon, a pendulum, with a law of physics apparently associated with it that will address some issues in studies of work, including radical reflexivity, whatever that might mean. And then Jeff Coulter, again, this is after lunch, after a coffee break, will develop a talk on ethnomethodology and linguistic phenomenology. And then finally, Graham Button and Wes Sharrock will present a paper titled "We Wouldn't Go There, Starting from Here." And then at the end of that, for a short time, I'll come back up and talk about sort of wrap-up issues for a short time before we all go. Okay, so I'd like to thank MMU for very generously supporting this meeting with minimal expense on my part and for Harold Garfinkel's part, and particularly Marie Chaulier for the organizational work that went into. I think you've all been in touch with her as part of setting up this meeting, and I'd like to thank her very much for that. Okay, does anybody have any preliminary questions before I proceed to the next item? And I have to change files. Okay. Yeah, oh. Okay, let's get another thing up. Okay, we're on. Good. So there are no questions on the preliminaries. So let's launch into this. Again, this is a kind of overview of the issues that we'll discuss in some detail during the day, for the rest of the day. First thing is, given that we've used this term radical ethnomethodology, first thing to discuss is what is or was radical about ethnomethodology and conversation analysis. First thing about that is that my preference is to treat ethnomethodology and conversation analysis as of one piece, as of one history, as of one basic set of themes. Rod Watson has used the expression, he may not be the only one, but I've read it in things that he's written, ethnomethodological CA, conversational analysis, which is a way of pointing to conversational analytical work that has a evident and authentic connection to themes that go back to the conspiracy between Harvey Sachs and Harold Garfinkel in the 60s and 70s. So we'll treat those together, although clearly when we're talking about current work in ethnomethodology and conversation analysis, there are some dramatic differences that many of us have written about in the past. We'll be talking a little bit, as I said in the early part of this, developments over the past 50 years and some of the things that may have happened in that interim, and raise a question about whether ethnomethodology or parts of it, prominent parts of it, have kind of been a paradigm lost in the sense that they've drifted away from the initiatives that made ethnomethodology and conversation analysis very distinctive programs. Doesn't mean they've been unsuccessful, but that their success has been bought at compromises that raise the question about, well, what makes them ethnomethodology or CA, not as a matter of definition so much, but as a matter of recognition. And then we do want to devote time to what remains or could remain radical about ethnomethodology, or another way of putting that is, what is it that any of us are doing, all of us are doing, that hasn't quite gotten there? Where are we falling down? Where are we, do we, or have we settled for finding the program to be impossible? And so this question of what could be done, or what could be done about it, is one that I hope that will come up and be a source after this meeting of some thinking and consternation, as well as celebration. So let's talk about radical. Obviously, it's a term that means different things to different people. Political, intellectual, epistemic, you name it. Generally, of course, etymologically, it means getting to the roots, uprooting, perhaps, rerouting or rerouting programs that exist. But it's looking back as well as looking forward. So when we think about in what sense is or was ethnomethodology in conversation analysis radical? One sense, I listed a bunch, this is by no means exhaustive, is that there's a phenomenological orientation to practices that constitute what we call society or social order. But it's doing phenomenology, and has for a long time, not from the first-person vantage point of the perceiver in the world or the being in the world individually, but from the point of view of communication, interaction, action with things in the world, so that you're never quite bound up in this notion of constitution through a transcendental ego, but a much more mundane, worldly orientation. Also, there's a long tradition, a thread of refraining from the privileges of theory, and by privileges I mean that the theorist takes it upon himself or herself to stipulate what the real world underlying the apparent world could possibly consist of. The famous writings in early chapters of Garfinkel about how the social sciences massively make the member out to be a cultural dope is associated with these privileges of theory. A technical aim, particularly or most clearly articulated in conversation analysis, is that claims, theoretical, empirical, or whatever, need to be made demonstrable rather than simply get nodding assent from people in an audience of astute intellectuals. Demonstrability with respect to materials of some sort in conversation analysis, which again, this is the most familiar example, the most developed example, is through tape recordings, videotapes, evident, observable, audible phenomena that can in some ways be pointed to specify what's present or what's absent. And a lot of thought and work has gone into this as a technical aim. Also, this is following traditions in philosophy of language and linguistic philosophy to treat language as part of diverse activities rather than something with either clear, unambiguous meanings or subject to clarification in terms of grammar and logic. And the idea is, of course, to see what is done with language, what sense is chained of language is chained to activity, not just linguistic activity, but activity with materials, activity with other people. The notions of language are not limited to reference, the words standing for things or for ideas. There's also a strong attention to interactional contingency and not to the structures of speech alone, as in many traditions of linguistics. And then there's et cetera, which itself is one of the founding principles of Garfinkel's ad hoc practices. As I said, I'm using the expression borrowed from Rod Watson, ethnomethodological CA. What I have in mind is something that's nicely expressed in a very early passage from Harvey Sachs. The published version of this was in the book by Atkinson and Heritage, although this particular passage apparently goes back to Sachs's master's thesis, which I believe was published in the early 60s, perhaps even late 50s, I'm not sure about that, but and perhaps with some editorial changes, because I don't think when Sachs wrote his master's thesis the words conversation analysis were used. But here in this passage he says, and he was not alive at the time this was published, I want to propose that a domain of research exists that is not part of any other established science, which I take to be a radical claim, right? Not part of any other established science, natural or social or whatever. That domain is one that those who are pursuing it have come to call ethnomethodology / conversation analysis. That domain seeks to describe methods persons use in doing social life. Now, that's a very plain, seemingly mundane expression. Activities, methods that persons use in doing social life. I mean, don't we all in sociology describe that? And it's in our claim that although the range of activities this domain describes may as yet be unknown, the mode of description, the way it is cast, is intrinsically stable. Now that raises further questions. What do you mean unknown if it's what the methods that persons use in doing social life? So there's this interesting issue about turning attention, you could call it reflexivity if you like, to the practices of doing social life in all sorts of occasions, and yet it's somehow unknown and remains to be described, and further descriptions will will explicate a stable activity. So there's a lot more to this passage than may meet the eye in a quick reading. Some further quotes, again, these quotes are often cited or recited. Garfinkel credits Egon Bittner, former student of his and colleague, contemporary, talking about the ordinary production of reasons, rules, following rules, citing rules, evidence, demonstration, etc., these plain creatures, in and as of the work of the streets, that is, as they're done in non-academic, largely, affairs, went away to college and came back educated. That is, the academics upgraded their logical clarity, specificity, and so forth. After the Greeks, blaming the Greeks for this initial work, you'd never recognize them. So the idea is that the long traditions, millennial-long traditions of intellectual reflection have, in a sense, created and taken ownership of very ordinary practices or methods of reasoning, of the uses of rules, of the citing and disputes about evidence, and so forth. Sachs, again, citing long intellectual traditions. So we're no longer just talking about sociology as a discipline or a particular social science, but something that's much longer as a lineage. A curious fact becomes apparent if you look at revolutionary scientific treatises back to the pre-Socratics and extending at least to Freud. And I think you can find this abundant today. Pierre Bourdieu is often cited as a prime figure who does this sort of thing. You find that they all begin by saying something like this: about the thing I'm going to talk about, people think they know, but they don't. And this was in the Purdue Symposium on Ethnomethodology. It's quoted in the introduction to one of the books by Graham Button and others. Manny Shagloff, who of course is still alive, although he has recently retired from doing active writing, from what I've heard, discussed more recently, 20 years ago or so, 18 years ago, a constraint in CA, and he's consistently talked about this sort of thing, to demonstrate, as I was saying before, this idea of demonstrability, the features of interest that are, to demonstrate that they are oriented to by the parties in a phone call or dinner conversation and so forth, rather than imposed on the scene by the analyst. And he says, this is a useful constraint on analysis in disciplining work to the indigenous preoccupations of the everyday world, being grasped and serving as a buffer against the potential for academic and theoretical imperialism, which imposes intellectuals' preoccupations on the world without respect to indigenous residents. Garfinkel preferred the term endogenous to indigenous, but I think think we're talking pretty much about the same thing. And again, this is kind of an academic politics issue, but not the usual kind of academic politics, where there's a deliberate effort to remain indifferent or to refrain from the kind of privileges of analysis that of theorizing that I talked about before. This is what I'm talking about when I talk about radical ethnomethodology in CA or ethnomethodological CA. It's questioning the linkage to classic sociological theory, particularly Durkheim. That's a contentious issue since Garfinkel himself has used Durkheim as kind of a touchstone for his own theorizing. Another source is what you'll hear about in the next talk from Doug Macbeth is an ongoing project involving him and me and Gustav Leimer, Oscar Lindwall, and Jonas Iverson, who spoke to us yesterday, and Gene Wong and Wendy Sherman, who's here today. And we're re-examining a recent, about 10-year-old program in conversation analysis that goes under the heading of epistemics. And I'll talk a little bit about that here, but mainly you'll hear about from Doug in the next talk. Another thing that I see to be radical about ethno-CA is the idea of examining a relationship to constructive analysis, and I'll explain a bit about what that means. And questions come out of this: is ethnomethodology an alternative, an alternate? What is its stance towards constructive analysis? Is it a newer, better science, or something altogether different than a newer and better science? Just a summary of what I've said so far. Social actions, that is all actions, insofar as we call them actions, are produced, made evident, displayed, and recognized as necessary feature of their accountability as actions. That is, they are embedded in society, they're constitutive of society, and once you get onto this, it's hard to imagine how they can be otherwise. The analytical task then is one of explicating that accountability that is already part of the production of society, rather than explaining or unmasking how actions arise from underlying forces, hidden motivations, remote causes, or deep assumptions and presuppositions. These are the sirens that always lure, are always inviting our theorists into their domain. So some of the developments over the past 50 years, they're often these days treated in more recently emergent or popular areas of social science as precursors. I remember more than 20 years ago an undergraduate student who was interested in discourse analysis, critical discourse analysis, saying, yeah, CA was a very useful predecessor for discourse analysis, and I think we see this in a number of areas that can invoke or fail to invoke that the methodology is having an important role in history, but it seems to have faded away. So that's one of the issues that animates my interest in having this gathering today. Ethno and CEA have become normalized in a sense. A term Graham Button suggested we used with reference to some of the theoretical treatments of Garfinkel as a classical sociological theorist. The introduction into the 2002 book, Ethnomethodology's Program by Ann Rawls, does some of that. I mean, it's a very useful and interesting introduction in lots of ways, but there is a way in which continuities are stressed over where Garfinkel was trying to make breaks. CA has been heralded as a normal science, which, if you understand Thomas Kuhn, is not such a bad thing to be, particularly in the social sciences, since a normal science has cumulative, progressive building of results. It's not, as some philosophers treated it, a degraded form of science that's just working out the details, puzzle solving, as if it's trivial. CA is a very demanding field, and people like Randall Collins have said it's a technically productive, cumulative science, and I think that's part of the identity of CA. However, it also has taken it in an empiricist direction. I think that deserves and warrants critical examination. And depending on your stance about this, you can see CA becoming integrated with other empirical programs. There have been moves to quantify CA, to more and more rely on collections of fragments, findings that are derived from collections. They're called distributional findings and so forth, that arguably divorce the analysis or take it further away from this engagement with what Shegloff in the prior quote called the indigenous preoccupations, the indigenous orientations of the members. I think it's fair to say that ethno and CA have largely differentiated from each other. They were already going that direction when I started as a graduate student in 1972. You pretty much had to choose between which way you would go, Sachs or Garfinkel. This was not just personal differences. There were some different trajectories, different commitments and work that were involved there, and it's continued that way. Ethnomethodology, at least as Garfinkel envisions it, remains closer to phenomenology, and certainly in Manchester, closer to the philosophical writings and critical social science writings of Wittgenstein and Lynch. But it's also rather diffuse and scattered, particularly when compared with conversation analysis. So this issue of paradigm lost is not a new issue. It's not like this happened yesterday. But in an unpublished writing in 1989, which Garfinkel circulated and initially wrote to be part of a book that was published, Talk and Social Structure, but turned out to be too long and unwieldy to publish in it. He had an appendix in which he spoke of what he called latter-day CA, which he dated to the death of Harvey Sachs in 1975. Sachs, as I think almost all of you know, died in a traffic accident at the age of 40 in 1975. And Garfinkel dated the kind of degeneracy of CA from that point. I think that perhaps is very arbitrary that he did it that way, but the idea was that CA had drifted away from what once was very closely allied to ethnomethodology as Garfinkel saw it. It became a normal science of practical action with standard methods of an observation language, incessant talk of data, technical interests that were developed. And more recently, there's been an increased integration with interactional linguistics, with a kind of micro-functionalist orientation. This is not all CA, but I think a substantial part of it. The analytic program, as I said before, arguably becomes increasingly divorced from the demand to demonstrate its relation to participants' orientations expressed in and through their actions as observed, recorded, understood. And then in some recent writings, the terms radical and heretical are used to characterize moves that are I would read as reverting to very conventional forms of sociology, using generalized models, coding fragments of transcript collected and analyzed as parts of collections. The use of quantification, from what I've seen, not much more than simple frequency counts and some correlational materials, but nonetheless moving in that direction, and also doing some beginnings of multivariate analysis where variables that impinge upon the conversation are connected. The conversational production is also sometimes analyzed as indexing extra conversational features that underlie the talk and interaction that's recorded. Again, I'm talking about this program of epistemics that Doug Macbeth as will be talking to us further about. And then there was a recent publication by Tanya Stivers, who's at UCLA, about the heretical, and the heretical was her word, move to code and quantify. So one question is, has conversation analysis gone the way of constructive analysis? And by constructive analysis, I'm using a term that Garfinkel occasionally used. He used others that have overlapping significance, like he talked about formal analysis, the worldwide social science movement that employs formal analysis, but I think constructive analysis has a certain specificity. And it's the idea that something like a model, something like a proxy, an index, a series of indicators will be used, or even a metaphor, will be used as the proximal formal structure that will be analyzed on behalf of what's not seen, or even what's not visible and cannot be made visible in any intelligible way. And so the analysis of the proxy is developing in kind of circular fashion the properties that are then attributed to the society, and insofar as they're not recognized by members of society, or if that is at all salient, they then are continued at the level of theorized realities, underlying realities that individuals are misrecognizing in their everyday common sense actions. Garfinkel spoke of ethnomethodology as not doing formal analysis and not competing with formal analysis to do better than formal analysis. He instead positioned ethnomethodology alongside formal analysis as the a way to come to terms with the work that formal analysis does and the work that does formal analysis. He used the expression asymmetric alternates to argue for a kind of priority of ethnomethodology with respect to formal analysis. The idea is, to use a simple example, and Brown and Laurier have done some very interesting work on this, and I've done some very shoddy work on this topic. You imagine getting from one place to another with a map, or with a GPS, or with any kind of navigational tool. It will give you a formal account of how to get there. Even a GPS is a formal account of the journey, even though it adapts itself as you go along. What you cannot recover from the formal analysis is all those contingencies of the practice, the dogs in the street, the pedestrians you have to watch out for, the way you handle the car while getting distracted by the GPS. All of these things are part of the journey that don't get recovered from the map, although you perhaps can use the map as a mnemonic to remember them afterwards. And so the asymmetry is, though the map is part of the journey, the map is consulted as part of the journey, or not, and but the journey has a surplus of detail that gives the map its sensibility as directions for how to get to a destination, or how to get from where you are in the present. So the asymmetry has to do with the unanticipated, but nonetheless observable, concrete, mundane details. It's not something mysterious, not something in some realm that's unknown or unimaginable, but it comes up in singular cases. It's observable in singular cases. It can be described, although perhaps never exhaustively, as part of the work of navigating. Okay? And there are many other things. Lucy Suchman did work with plans of situated actions, which had very, very immense effect on the high-tech industries like Xerox PARC, where she worked when she did that. George Sathis, Harold Garfinkel, and others have also done work with navigational tools, instructions, recipes, and so forth. And again, the asymmetry is that although these are highly useful, they're not faulted for being incomplete. Highly useful for getting around, for doing things, for guiding, for correcting actions. there's always this pairing with doing on singular occasions. So thinking about radical ethnomethodology, one issue that came up some years ago from Melvin Palmer was the claim that ethnomethodology, as he put it, had moved to the suburbs, had lost its radical character, and he used the term radical reflexivity as kind of corrective of what ethnomethodology once had as part of its agenda and had lost. He wrote a paper published in the American Sociological Review in the early 1990s called Left of Ethnomethodology, where left was double entendre that had to do with what has been left out of ethnomethodology, as well as moving ethnomethodology to the left in some sense, more radical, not necessarily politically, but more daring, more challenging to convention. And he also returned to the theme in some posthumous writings that were published, where he reviewed Garfinkel's book, Ethnomethodology Program. Palmer made a distinction between endogenous and radical referential reflexivity, where endogenous reflexivity is the way, for instance, a question is understood as a question in view of the circumstances out of which it comes, and it is contributing to those circumstances the very way that it's a question. And so there's this reflexive or circular relationship between understanding a question and the circumstances, and contributing to those, constituting those very circumstances through the question and its understanding, its uptake, and so forth. That's endogenous. It's something that's common to CA and ethnomethodology. What he also targeted ethnomethodological studies of work, and we're going to engage with this in the thing that Dusan Balic and I will be doing with the pendulum this afternoon. By studying work practices in situ, trying to engage with their details, and work doesn't just mean what people do for a living. It can be your favorite activity when you do outside work, or cooking around your kitchen, all sorts of things. Palmer argued that ethnomethodology is losing its distinctive intellectual character by kind of subverting itself or subordinating itself, going native in these activities that it studied. And he contrasted the empiricist turn in ethnomethodology to post-structuralist and related developments in constructionist social science and literary studies. And my take on this, and I've argued about this in the past, is that Palmer, although he talks about as radical, is turning to a very old form of reflection, where the intellectual somehow has a capacity or a practice that deepens thought, understands what common sense overlooks, opens up the taken for granted, and has recourse to some reservoir of transcendental knowledge that is informing what mere natives do in their everyday life. And that's perhaps putting it a little simple. I'd recommend read Palmer, get your own opinion of it, but this idea that the world is constituted through this kind of reflective activity, I mean the real basis for the world, is not, in my view, or Garfinkel's view, I'm sure, a radical program. It's, in fact, it's the oldest thing in the world. It's classic. It goes back to Plato's cave. Whether you like it or not, it's the stuff of the Enlightenment. And so the question then is, does this endogenous reflexivity, which Palmer treats as a rather mundane sort of thing, perhaps it has it encourages a reflexivity that is more radical than what Palmer seems to take to be radical. So there are a bunch of open questions, and I hope we do address these. I want to wind down fairly quickly here. where is ethnomethodology positioned to constructive analysis and to what arguably are moves towards constructive analysis, even under the rubric of ethnomethodology? How can ethnomethodology address constructive analysis as an alternative or alternate without falling into a preference for some privilege of theory or a metaphysical scheme or invoking ideology, invoking imaginaries, frames, and so forth, so that there's that distance between the intellectual position and the position being analyzed? Is it necessary, or isn't it necessary, to constitute data but through some sort of intermediary intervention? You can't just observe the world as it is, can you? Just try that in a room full of social sciences. Just say, just look. And it's not a good strategy for social or for professional survival. And by the way, many people are, what's wrong with constructive analysis? We got to do it. It's productive. It's not just academic. Classifying, coding, quantifying, it's all over the place. So why not do that? And it certainly isn't particular to social science. Where we live in administered societies, this kind of thing's being done to us all the time, whether we like it or not. So the question that many people would argue is it possible to develop adequate constructs, adequate codes, classifications, even within the terms of ethnomethodology, that do justice to the orientations that people have? And I think this is part of the argument we could be having. The position that I'm taking, and I hope that many of you see as at least consistent with, and perhaps better than that, traditions of ethnomethodology, is that ethnomethodology is an alternate. That is, it's not doing the same thing. It's not a critique of formal analysis, although certain critical understandings are unavoidable when you take this position. The effort is to re-examine how constructive analysis in its infinite varieties are done in practice. How are data rendered serially in the course of a scientific project? Garfinkel's studies of coding practices in studies in ethnomethodology is an exemplar of what's been done in many sciences, natural and social. The kinds of examples I mentioned earlier of following instructions in a wide variety of circumstances can be productive of insight. You can also do it backwards. Rather than following instructions, trace backwards from a formal text to the practices through which it was assembled. And then, as has been done many times, examine how interviewers in a social survey enact the protocols they are given, which can have very interesting methodological consequences. And then, as Doug Macbeth will tell us, the epistemic project examine the analysis of singular cases in publications. That is, see how are those cases assembled, how are they unpacked, how are they related to the, when possible, the phone calls that were recorded from which they were taken. How is the model worked in given instances in published papers, and if you have access outside publications, those sorts of things. So ethnomethodology is not necessarily a critique, but sometimes I would argue critique is unavoidable. When Wittgenstein talks about psychology, or Lynch talks about social studies, or Husserl talks about positive science, they're very definite critical implications, even though what's being done is an analysis of work in some sense. But because of the relation of these fields to the practices that they claim to be examining, that their second order relation to these raises problems that need to be engaged. So many of Garfinkel's remarks at the methodology's programmatic issues, I would argue, are incompatible with the theory, methods, and directions in the social sciences. And the developed example we have is of the epistemic program in conversation analysis, and to us it suggests a systematic set of problems with that interpretive program. So, questions to ask, again, I'm sure I hope plenty of questions come to mind, is One is radical ethnomethodology, an exercise in nostalgia, an attempt to reverse the inevitable, not necessarily decline, but integration into the greater body of social sciences. I'd say no. I would say that at least the work that we've done on the epistemics project has reacquainted me with what was and remains radical about conversation analysis, although it's endangered, I think, even among some of its leading proponents. Another question is there a program to replace the normalization of Garfinkel and CA, since they are successful in their own fields? And my answer is ambiguous because I don't know. I hope so. And finally, what would it look like to actually do ethnomethodology? Have any of us done it yet? Is it possible to do? So with that, from what I've said, my overview, and we'll have some time for questions, the remainder of the day is going to be made up of a talk by Doug Macbeth, which will start after a coffee break. Does ethnomethodology CA have a soft underbelly? And then Dushan and I will talk about studies of work, radical reflexivity, and a unique adequacy requirement with a pendulum. Jeff Coulter will talk about ethnomethodology and linguistic phenomenology. Graham Button and Wes Sharrock will then finish up with, we wouldn't go there, starting from here, talking about where we are, where we could be going. And then I'll have a brief wrap up at the end. So, some more slides. If you're interested in some recommended sources, here's a few. Obviously, there's many more you could read. I recommend you go to the Sharrock and Anderson archive. It's a growing body of papers, largely by Wes and Bob, but also by others. And then there's 2 volumes by Brownsfield and Tolmie, came out fairly recently. A book by Button and others on deconstructing ethnography, pointed towards ubiquitous computing and interactional systems design, but I would argue it's significant beyond that as well. And then to plug something that I'm part of, we're doing a special issue of discourse studies coming out in October on the epistemic program, and then a couple of other books that have been around a while. There's No Such Thing as a Social Science by Hutchinson et al., and then Coulter and Sharrock, Brain, Mind, and Human Behavior. And so if you find talks today interesting, intriguing, these are some sources that you could go to deepen them.